Okay, so this is the second video lecture for Chapter 1 in General Psychology. And in the previous lecture, I talked about the origins of psychology and noted how the discipline or the study, the term didn't even exist until you get to the 20th century, and how it's been a very old question, the question of the relationship between the brain and behavior, also the interactive dualism exercise. Also wanted to say again about the Phineas Gage gentleman. There is a video assignment, requires you to watch this little short story about him and then just comment about your reaction. But the significance of Phineas Gage into chapter 1 is because of him, because of his accident, he lended a lot of research questions before technology was readily available. Okay, so this slide represents some people. And I don't ask you necessarily to match the people, but I want you to get a sense as to sort of how they're all related to each other. And there will be a couple people on the next slide that there will be quiz questions over. But for instance, I don't ask you to memorize, who Wilhelm Wundt is, but I do ask you at some point to know who William James is, or at least know of his ideas. Okay, so some of the people you've got, and honestly, I forget who is who on this image. One of them is Wundt, one of them is Titchener, and one of them is James. Wundt is considered the father, if you will, of psychology because he's the first one, apparently, so goes the history books, to use the term. So the thing about the history of science and the history of knowledge, which is a very interesting, called epistemology. It's a very interesting field of study to understand sort of where ideas come from and their origin and how they evolve. But all sciences, economics, archaeology, psychology, sociology, all of them really begin with these questions about the meaning of life, or they all begin with religious and spirit and philosophical questions. It's why when you get a PhD, it's a doctor of philosophy, because philosophy is where all thinking and questioning of the world begins. And so Wundt's contribution is he was really advocating that the questions that psychology was asking were different than the questions of philosophy, and wants to focus more or directs some of the questioning to the biological, right? That we're asking different questions than philosophers ask. He is one of his questions, and I always it's kind of fun. It's an interesting question to ask. Is he asks, how long would it take for someone to be consciously aware of a bell ringing? And so this was what he spent his life studying, or part of his life studying, would ring a bell and ask his subjects, how long till you became aware of that bell? And what he did with that, with his data and the functionality of asking that question, I'm not entirely sure. But that would be Wilhelm Wundt. Now, what psychologists have that say they don't have in sociology is they actually have like academic trees, the same way you'd have a family tree. That this student, and it all goes back to Wundt, right? So I studied with Richard Harris, who studied with somebody who studied with somebody who studied with Wilhelm Wundt, right? Just sort of the evolution, because after all, that's what teaching and learning is. It's passing along knowledge. Well, Wundt's student is this fellow by the name of Titchener, Edward Titchener. And Titchener is one of these guys on here too. I think Titchener is actually this fella down here on the bottom right. Titchener is famous for, aside from that being a fun name to say, he is famous for a part of psychology called structuralism. Now, sociology would talk about structuralism, but that's not the kind of structuralism we're talking about here. Structuralism in this case is understanding or recognizing the structures of consciousness, right? So similar to what Wundt is doing, but he advocated for this phenomenon called introspection. And this is your larger chapter assignment, right? Introspection. And I ask you, if you don't already do this, to spend some time becoming introspective. And if you maybe if you've ever been accused of being introspective, but what that means is, and this is also a quiz question, what does introspection mean? It means to be consciously aware of your thoughts and your sensations. Or, as I think I call the assignment, to think about thinking. Or another pop culture term that we use a lot these days is mindfulness. To become aware, sensitive to, of what is happening in your mind and your consciousness and your body, right? Or meditate, basically, right? To turn your awareness inward into what's going on in your head, what your body is experiencing, and what your thoughts are. The introspection, now for some students, this is very easy because they already do it. For others, they really struggle because it may sound like an easy task, but what I'm inviting you to do in this assignment, and I think the assignment says 15 minutes, which is a very long time. I mean, people have to practice. I used to do some, we called it centering prayer, which is a form of introspection, but it's in the context of like prayer and church and things like this. And we would go for 20 minutes, but we would practice to get up to 20 minutes. So your goal, or the goal I invite you to think about, is for 5 minutes, sit quietly, and it doesn't need to be in complete silence, but it's easier sometimes if it's in silence, and turn your awareness inward and become and introspect. What are you thinking? How is your body feeling? You may hear things go by or see things. Sometimes it's easier if your eyes are closed, but a lot of people fall asleep. But pay attention to what's happening. Notice, for instance, if when you have certain thoughts, does that cause your heart rate to go up? Does it cause your heart rate to go down? Do you notice your palms getting sweaty? So for instance, can you draw your awareness to your hands? Do you notice if your hands are fisted or relaxed? And that's what we mean by introspection, right? Introspection is, so for Titchener, in order for him to collect data on his research subjects, he had to teach them to be this way, to introspect, to become aware of their sensations and their thoughts. And this meant that it limited the questions he could ask. It limited who he could use as subjects. You can't really it's difficult to teach children this. You can't do this kind of research model on animals. But this is a sophisticated step beyond what Wundt was doing. Then you get to, I don't know if James actually is a student of Titchener or not, but then you get to this fellow by the name of William James. And if you've ever heard the term stream of consciousness, that is attributed to James. And the idea of a stream of consciousness, we'll talk more about it in another chapter, but it's the notion that our awareness, our consciousness is like a river or like a stream, in the same way that rivers and streams get wider in some places and narrower in other places. Our consciousness shifts from one thing to another thing. And this school of thought, this school of thought is what's commonly referred to as functional. So James wanted to know, or he was less interested in the structures of our awareness and when you notice the bell, but more why. What is the role of dreaming, right? Which is a state of consciousness. What is the role of sleep, or when we zone out? Why do we zone out, right? When we psychologists have observed that we can't pay attention, we cannot be consciously aware of everything. So what is the function of noticing certain things but not other things, right? And this is what we mean by functionalism. It's the same question about awareness, but it moves from simply learning how to be aware and recognizing the different parts of our awareness to asking the question, why? Why do we dream? Which is a fun topic in and of itself. Okay, the next lecture, didn't get very far on this one, did we? In the next lecture, I want to talk about a few more people, but these specifically related to the 20th century.